January 10th, 2021, Heinz Field, Pittsburgh. The Cleveland Browns had not won a playoff game in 26 years. They walked into Pittsburgh Stadium and scored 28 points before the first quarter ended. Final score, Cleveland Browns 48 to Pittsburgh Steelers 37. But here is the thing. The Browns once owned this rivalry so completely that Pittsburgh spent an entire decade unable to finish above 500. When did Cleveland stop being Pittsburgh's big brother? And can they ever get that back? To understand why Cleveland lost the top spot, you have to go back to before the Browns even played a game. Pittsburgh had been the NFL's punching bag since 1933, 12 seasons without a winning record, a franchise that felt more like a formality than a football team. Then Paul Brown arrived in Cleveland in 1946 and built something the league had never seen, a machine, precise, merciless, dominant from the first snap. The Steelers were still figuring out how to win. The Browns were already rewriting what winning meant. The Browns entered the NFL in 1950 as refugees from the All-America Football Conference, a league the establishment had spent years dismissing as a minor operation. The skeptics said Cleveland would get exposed once they faced real competition. Cleveland won the NFL championship in their first season. Paul Brown had built a system, a philosophy of precision that treated the game as something closer to engineering than athletics. He called plays from the sideline through messenger guards, a practice so radical that other coaches complained it was unsportsmanlike. He installed a playbook so detailed that his players spent more time in the classroom than most college students. And he had Otto, a quarterback with the instincts of a chess grandmaster and the arm to back it up. Pittsburgh had Jim Finks, a quarterback with genuine talent. They had Art Rooney Sr., who had owned the franchise since 1933 and watched it lose with a patience that bordered on sainthood. Dan Rooney would later say, "I have spent my entire life devoted to the Pittsburgh Steelers and the National Football League." And that devotion was visible in the Rooney family long before it produced any reward. Cleveland did not wait for anything. Over the first 2 decades of this rivalry, the Browns went 32-10 against Pittsburgh. 1,110 points scored to 679, a margin of 431 points across 20 years. That is not a rivalry. That is a lesson, repeated twice a year until the student stops raising his hand. On October 4th, 1952, at Forbes Field, the Steelers led. Finks connected with L.B. Nickel on a 10-yard touchdown pass, but Graham found Marion Motley on a 68-yard strike. Lou Groza converted. Final score, Cleveland Browns 21 to Pittsburgh Steelers 20. Pittsburgh had played well enough to win. Graham had simply played better. 6 weeks later, on November 16, 1952, the Steelers came to Cleveland Municipal Stadium with something to prove. Finks threw 4 touchdown passes. Pittsburgh scored 28 points in the second half, clawing back from a deficit that should have buried them. The crowd felt it. This was the day Pittsburgh finally broke through. But Dante Lavelli caught a 22-yard touchdown pass from Graham. Lou Groza drilled an 11-yard field goal. A safety added 2 more points. Cleveland had done most of its damage before halftime, and every Pittsburgh push still ran into one more answer. The math kept working against the Steelers, no matter how well they played. Final score, Cleveland Browns 29 to Pittsburgh Steelers 28. They lost by 1. Finks walked off having done nearly everything a quarterback could do, and it had not been enough. The Steelers were not losing because they were bad. They were losing because Cleveland was something else entirely. By 1961, a young advertising executive named Art Modell had purchased the Browns, a sum that made him, at 36, one of the youngest owners in the league. He arrived with the unshakable belief that he understood the franchise better than the man who built it. Paul Brown noticed. The tension grew through the early 1960s, quiet and steady. On October 22, 1961, at Forbes Field, Cleveland won again, 30-28, on a Lou Groza field goal and a Bobby Mitchell rushing touchdown, holding off a Pittsburgh rally. The Browns kept finding ways. They always found ways. But in January 1963, Modell fired Paul Brown. The coach who had invented the franchise, whose name was literally sewn onto the helmets, was removed by an owner who had been in the building for 2 years. Brown cleared out his office and left. He would resurface in Cincinnati, building the Bengals from scratch, spending the rest of his life making sure Cleveland regretted the decision. Jim Brown arrived in 1957 and spent 9 seasons making every defensive coordinator in the NFL feel personally insulted. He ran with a combination of power and grace the game had not seen before. But after the 1965 season, at 29 years old, with his talent still at its peak, he retired to pursue an acting career. He simply walked away. Without Paul Brown's system, and without Jim Brown's legs, the question that had never needed asking suddenly had no answer. What were the Cleveland Browns exactly? In Pittsburgh, Art Rooney Sr. kept the faith. In 1969, he hired a quiet, methodical assistant coach from Baltimore named Chuck Noll, who had opinions about the draft, about building through the trenches, about patience. Nobody in Cleveland paid attention. Everything Cleveland built over 20 years is about to flip, completely, and it will take 50 years to flip back. Chuck Noll arrived in Pittsburgh in 1969, carrying a legal pad full of draft notes and a philosophy built on one word: patience. Cleveland had spent 20 years proving patience was unnecessary when you already had the best players. Noll understood something different. He understood that you could build a defense so violent, so coordinated, so fundamentally mean that it would make the other team's offense feel like a suggestion. He started with a defensive tackle from North Texas State named Joe Greene. Mean Joe Greene. The nickname was not a marketing invention. It was a warning. Greene later recalled that Noll had truth and belief in what he was saying, and that belief transferred to every player who lined up beside him. Ham, Blunt, Lambert, White. Within 5 years, Pittsburgh had assembled the most feared defensive unit in professional football history. They called it the Steel Curtain, and the name fit. You did not run through it. You ran into it and stopped. Cleveland had dominated Pittsburgh for 20 years. The power dynamic had felt as permanent as geography. But Noll's 1976 Steelers came to Three Rivers Stadium in September and handed the Browns a lesson in what the new order looked like. Brian Sipe connected with Reggie Rucker on a 14-yard touchdown strike, then found Oscar Rohn for another scoring play. Cleveland found the end zone, and Pittsburgh answered every single time. Terry Bradshaw threading a 14-yard touchdown to John Stallworth with ease that suggested the outcome had never been in doubt. Final score: Pittsburgh Steelers 31 to Cleveland Browns 14. The Browns had not been embarrassed. They had been outclassed, which was worse. Outclassed meant the gap was structural, not situational. Art Rooney Sr. had watched his franchise lose for 4 decades with a patience that bordered on religious devotion. Noll disliked the term messenger boy so much that as coach, he entrusted all play calling to his quarterbacks, a direct rejection of Paul Brown's model. 4 Super Bowls in 6 years proved the point. The Steel Curtain era did not just flip the rivalry, it buried the version that had existed before it. Cleveland kept fighting through the 1980s. Bernie Kosar arrived with a sidewinder delivery and a football IQ that made defensive coordinators lose sleep. The Browns reached the AFC Championship game in 1986 and 1987, then returned to the playoffs in 1988 and 1989, including another trip to the conference championship after the 1989 season. But the heartbreak came from Denver, not Pittsburgh. Losses that carved permanent wounds into Cleveland's identity without involving the Steelers at all. By 1994, Bill Belichick had the Browns back in the playoffs. Cleveland traveled to Three Rivers Stadium for the AFC Divisional Round on January 7, 1995. It had been nearly 3 decades since Cleveland had played for a league title, a fan base that had watched the Steelers collect championships the way Cleveland once had. Maybe this was the turn. Pittsburgh opened the scoring with a Gary Anderson field goal from 39 yards. Eric Greene caught a 2-yard touchdown pass from Neil O'Donnell. John Williams then broke free for a 26-yard touchdown run in the second quarter. Cleveland trailed 10-0, and Pittsburgh added one more score before the Browns finally got on the board with a late first-half field goal. It was not a convincing victory. It was a 29-9 playoff loss that still felt like a door slamming shut. 10 months later, on November 6, 1995, Art Modell announced the Browns were moving to Baltimore. Only after the move did the league's promise of a 1999 expansion team become Cleveland's lifeline. The man who had bought the franchise in 1961, who had fired Paul Brown because he believed he understood the team better than its creator, had run run out of road. The stadium was aging. The finances had curdled. He had spent years watching the Steelers win while his own franchise drifted. He made the call. Cleveland kept the name, the colors, the history, the records. Everything else, the roster, the coaches, the players, the institutional knowledge, loaded onto trucks and headed south. The franchise that had invented dominance in professional football ceased to exist on a Tuesday in November. When the Browns come back in 1999, they will have to start from scratch. And their first real test? Pittsburgh. Of course, it is Pittsburgh. The NFL kept its promise. In 1999, the Cleveland Browns returned. Same name, same colors, same stadium address. But the franchise that had spent 2 decades treating Pittsburgh like a practice squad had not come back. What came back was an expansion team built from cast-offs, late-round picks, and organizational hope. Their first test came on September 12, 1999, at Cleveland Browns Stadium. Kordell Stewart scored on a 1-yard rush. Chris Brown added an 18-yard field goal. Richard Huntley caught a 5-yard pass and walked into the end zone. Pittsburgh did not sweat. Pittsburgh did not need to. Final score, Pittsburgh Steelers 43 to Cleveland Browns nothing. The NFL had promised Cleveland a team by 1999, but expansion franchises are built to lose, and this one was built to lose badly. Tim Couch took snaps behind an offensive line that offered suggestions rather than protection. The roster had depth the way a puddle has depth. One voice in Cleveland's market said it plainly. You look at the long-hated rivals of the Browns, which is the Steelers. I don't even know if you could call it a rivalry anymore. The Browns cycled through quarterbacks the way other franchises cycle through special teams coaches. Couch, Holcomb, Garcia, Anderson. Each one arrived with a different arm angle and left with the same record. Pittsburgh, meanwhile, ran the opposite model. One head coach at a time, patient drafting, institutional memory that stretched back to Chuck Noll's legal pads. Bill Cowher had inherited that infrastructure and spent a decade building on it. He drafted a 20-year-old quarterback from Miami of Ohio in the first round in 2004 and handed him the keys. Ben Roethlisberger did not look like a franchise savior. He looked like a redshirt sophomore who wandered into the wrong building. But he had size, pocket awareness, and an almost reckless belief in his own ability to extend plays until something broke open. Cleveland had no answer for any of it. Before all that, though, there was January 5th, 2003. Kelly Holcomb had spent most of his career as a backup, the kind of player whose talent everyone acknowledged and nobody quite trusted. He was quiet, precise, and carried himself with the calm of someone who had spent years waiting for a moment that might never arrive. In the 2002 AFC wildcard at Heinz Field, the moment arrived. The stakes were everything Cleveland had been building toward. 4 years of expansion team losses, of rebuilding from nothing, of asking fans to believe that the Browns could compete with a franchise that had won 4 Super Bowls in the previous 3 decades. This game was proof of concept. Holcomb came out throwing. William Greene punched in a 1-yard score. Then Dennis Northcutt ran a 32-yard crossing route, and Holcomb dropped it in perfectly for another touchdown, Phil Dawson converting the extra point. Cleveland moved the ball with a fluency nobody had seen from this offense, and for stretches of that afternoon, Holcomb looked like the quarterback Cleveland had been cycling through backups trying to find. He threw for 429 yards. He kept the Browns in front late in the fourth quarter against a Pittsburgh team that had been to this game before. But Antoine Randall fielded a punt 66 yards from the end zone and did not stop running. The return came in the second quarter, and the game still had room to twist. Cleveland scored again, held the lead deep into the fourth quarter. Then, with 58 seconds left, Pittsburgh finally moved in front for good. Final score, Pittsburgh Steelers 36 to Cleveland Browns 33. Holcomb's 429 yards became a footnote. Cleveland's first playoff appearance since the franchise returned ended in a 3-point loss that felt like it had been decided by something other than talent. Cowher had survived the closest call of his coaching career against a team that had no business threatening him. He had not looked comfortable. He had looked like a man who understood exactly how close he had come to losing his legacy to an expansion team in year 4. The Browns kept fighting. In 2007, Derek Anderson threw 29 touchdown passes, and Cleveland finished 10-6. The season opener against Pittsburgh, a 34-7 loss at home, suggested the gap remained. But the Browns won 10 games. They were legitimate. They missed the playoffs on a tiebreaker. 10 wins, sitting home in January. The front office thanked Anderson for his contributions and moved on, the way Cleveland always moved on. One voice in the building said, "I want to thank Derek for everything that he gave to the Cleveland Browns organization over the last 5 years," and then started the search for the next answer. Pittsburgh won Super Bowls after the 2005 and 2008 seasons. Cleveland went 5-11 in 2008, 5-11 again in 2009, then 4-12 in 2010, before another 5-11 in 2011. The years blurred together because the result kept feeling the same. The gap was a canyon, and Cleveland kept throwing rope bridges across it that snapped under the weight. By the early 2010s, the expansion era had produced one playoff appearance, one heartbreaking near miss, and a roster in permanent reconstruction. The question that had been building since 1995, whether the real Browns had died when the trucks left for Baltimore, had no clean answer. The colors were the same. The name was the same. The losses felt very familiar, but something was forming in Cleveland's draft room. A quarterback from Oklahoma, and a Thursday night in 2019 that would remind everyone exactly what this rivalry could become when Cleveland stopped being afraid of it. Myles Garrett arrived in Cleveland in 2017 as the first overall pick, a pass rusher from Texas A&M with the kind of athletic profile that scouts describe once a generation. Baker Mayfield arrived the following year, also first overall, a quarterback from Oklahoma who had grown up watching Cleveland cycle through signal callers the way other cities cycle through weather. 2 number-1 picks in 2 years. The Browns had talent again, real talent, the kind that could make Pittsburgh uncomfortable. But the franchise around them was still broken. Between 2016 and 2017, Cleveland went 1 win and 31 losses. The Steelers won the division again. The gap between the franchises was not a gap anymore. It was geological. November 14th, 2019, Thursday Night Football, First Energy Stadium. The Browns led Pittsburgh 21-7 in the final seconds. Mike Tomlin had announced that Ben Roethlisberger would not play, with Mason Rudolph getting the start. The game was decided. Then Garrett sacked Rudolph. Rudolph grabbed at Garrett's helmet. Garrett grabbed back. And in the space of 3 seconds, everything that had built up over years of losing came out in one catastrophic motion. Garrett pulled Rudolph's helmet off and swung it at his head. The league suspended Garrett indefinitely. The aftermath was immediate and brutal. Cleveland's season collapsed. The incident became the story. Not the talent, not the potential, the swing. But what followed was something the script did not predict. Garrett came back in 2020 and played with a focus that looked almost punitive. The Browns, improbably, made the playoffs for the first time since 2002. Baker Mayfield had become the quarterback who might actually end the drought. The wild card opponent, Pittsburgh, at Heinz Field. Kevin Stefanski tested positive for COVID-19 the week of the game. The head coach would not be on the sideline for the most important game his franchise had played in 26 years. Multiple starters were also out. The football gods had not finished with Cleveland yet. January 10th, 2021, Heinz Field. The Steelers had gone 12-4 that season, playing at home as division champions. Cleveland was the 6th seed, missing their coach, missing pieces. Carl Joseph recovered a fumble in the end zone. Cody Parkey converted. Baker Mayfield found Jarvis Landry on a 40-yard strike. Kareem Hunt punched in an 11-yard rush. Before Pittsburgh could process what was happening, the Browns had scored 28 points in the first quarter. 28 points in Pittsburgh in the first 15 minutes. The Steelers fought back methodically, stubbornly. The second half tightened. Browns fans who had watched this franchise collapse in big moments for 2 decades held their breath through every Pittsburgh possession. They had seen this before. The late lead, the fade, the familiar heartbreak. It did not come. Final score, Cleveland Browns 48 to Pittsburgh Steelers 37. The Browns' first playoff win since January 1994. 26 years of waiting, and it happened in Pittsburgh, with their head coach watching from a hotel room on a laptop. The little brother had thrown a punch that landed. Garrett, who had stood at the center of the rivalry's ugliest moment 14 months earlier, was on that field when the clock hit 0. The player who had arrived as Cleveland's hope became the face of its lowest moment, and then refused to let that moment be his whole story. He was there for this one too. The Cleveland Browns front office later said they had tremendous gratitude for Stefanski's leadership of the franchise, and that gratitude started with this night. But the carousel did not stop. Baker Mayfield, the quarterback who had delivered that playoff win, was gone within 2 years. Cleveland traded for Deshaun Watson. Watson struggled. The Browns were back to searching for answers at the position that had haunted them since the expansion era began. 1 playoff win. 6 Pittsburgh Super Bowl trophies. The question was never whether Cleveland could compete compete for a night. The question was always whether they could sustain it. The 2025 season was supposed to tell us whether that wild card win was a turning point or just another tease. It delivered a familiar answer. Cleveland finished below Pittsburgh in the AFC North again. The Browns cycled through quarterback decisions that would exhaust a less devoted fan base. Deshaun Watson's tenure ended with injury and disappointment. The front office moved on, the way Cleveland always moves on. But the roster Garrett anchors is not a pretender's roster. He remains one of the most disruptive pass rushers in football, a player Pittsburgh game plans around every time these teams meet. The Browns added pieces in the 2025 offseason. The search for a franchise quarterback, the same search defining this franchise since the expansion era, continued with new names attached. Pittsburgh is navigating its own transition too, with a new coach, new questions at quarterback, and no clean post-Roethlisberger answer yet. The 2026 season opens in September. Same division, same two cities connected by 70 miles of highway. Here is the partial answer. Cleveland was the big brother once, genuinely and completely. The Browns built professional football's first dynasty while Pittsburgh was still learning to lose with dignity. That history is real. It happened. Whether it can happen again is a different question. The Steelers have 6 Lombardi trophies and a culture built on stability. The Browns have Myles Garrett, a fan base that has absorbed more heartbreak than any city deserves, and a belief that refuses to die no matter how many times the evidence suggests it should. 2 proud cities, 1 highway. A September date circled on every calendar in both. If this hit different, subscribe before you leave. We're pushing toward 10,000, and every rivalry in NFL history is on the list. The next one might be yours. There's a video on your screen right now. Don't let the algorithm bury it.